Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. As regular listeners know, this is mainly a history podcast, but we do throw in other subjects as well. And in particular, I like to do episodes on film. And this is a film episode. I have two guests this week. First of all is Jasper Sharp. He is one of Britain's leading experts, maybe the leading British expert on Japanese film. And Japanese film is something I'm particularly interested in, so I asked Jasper to pick 6 Japanese films he thought were particularly noteworthy and to come on and chat about them. So welcome, Jasper, to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's hard narrowing down my favourites down to 6 films, all 6 films that are worth talking about. And as we all know, Japanese film is a vast subject. 500 a year, I think, at the moment. So, this is basically only a taste of what's out there, really.
Okay. And then I asked, I felt a bit intimidated because Jasper really is the expert on Japanese film. So I thought I needed some reinforcements. So I thought I would get Scott Sumner on the podcast to join me. He's been on before, and he's mainly known as a very distinguished economist from the United States, but he also has a sideline in reviews of some of the best and maybe, I suppose as well, some of the worst films in the history of cinema. And I've slightly lost count of how many reviews there are, but I think it's now north of 1,000. Anyway, welcome, Scott, to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Okay, Jasper, we're kind of in your hands. So where do you want to start and how do you want to do this?
Right. Well, I gave you a rough list, and I thought, where do we begin? I mean, where is the best entry point into Japanese cinema? Usually the 2 big names that always get mentioned are Akira Kurosawa and Yasujiro Ozu, as emblemizing very different sides of Japanese cinema. For me, we had this discussion earlier, didn't we, really, that Kurosawa, sort of a lot of Japanese people at the time, that he was making films, the dialogue around Kurosawa was that he wasn't really a Japanese film director, that he made Western films for Western audiences, which again is contentious in its own right. But it's funny, I've always found how a lot of people who are interested in Japanese cinema sort of tend to dismiss Kurosawa, and sort of that's what we're going to do today, because I want to put the focus more on Yasujiro Ozu, who is the other side of the coin, in that there's so much baggage attached to him that, whereas Kurosawa seems very accessible, I think Ozu is always seen as that's a little bit rarefied, and that you have to really understand Japanese aesthetics and culture to really get a grip on his work. And I would just like to dispel all of that and say that, if you've never seen an Ozu film before, go and watch one, really. and this is a director who was making films, from the 1920s up until his death in 1963, I think it was. The ones of the post-war period are generally known as being about the family, and there's this sort of other thing is that, that all his films are generally the same. They've usually got very seasonal titles like Early Spring or Late Spring or Early Summer or Autumn Afternoon. The title I want to focus on is Equinox Flower, which was Ozu's first colour film. And I gave you the list, Hugh. I don't know if you had a chance to...
I went through them all. I don't know if Scott, you'd already seen quite a lot of them. I think there were 1 or 2 you hadn't seen.
Right. I'd seen 4 of them, and I saw the other 2 more recently on your suggestion. So thank you.
Usually people always, mention Ozu in conjunction with Tokyo Stories is seen as his classic, as one of the greatest films of all time. And I think it's an amazing film, but I do think it's quite heavy. It sort of fits into this idea that Ozu is sort of hard work. And I think Equinox Flower is quite breezy. It generally is a good starting place with Ozu because it focuses on a sort of upper middle class family in Japan, salaryman father, stay-at-home mum, and 2 daughters, each with their very different idea of romance and marriage. And, there's that setup with Ozu films where it's like the parents are always trying to get their daughters married off or out into the world, but there's a slight degree of regret and sadness that about the whole breakup of the family unit. And this particular film, as I said, it was his very first colour film, and there's something we should say about the Ozu style. It's very pristine. It's the perspectives are very flattened. Everything is filmed from like a sort of 50mm angle, which 50mm lens. So it sort of preserves the sort of spatial integrity that we would see with our human eyes. It doesn't enlarge or distort the image in front of it. So what we're getting generally is this film that unfolds in these sort of tableaux, which are very decorative. And I always think of this idea that the camera in Ozu films is very low, so that they always say it's like, it's because it's as if you were sat on a tatami mat. But it's more to do with the flattening of the perspective. So you're looking at the sort of shoji screens and the architecture of the room, and it's sort of arranged in these sort of grid-like compositions where the human elements sort of are part of this overall composition. And I think it gives this idea that you're never meant to adapt any single person's perspective. And one of the things that is very, very visual in Equinox Flower is that in a lot of the living room scenes, they're all sitting around the table, and again, it shows that it's a sort of modern time. You see them sitting there with bottles of Fanta Orange at times, and just because it's to do with Ozu's sense of composition, this use of colour, of getting your eye drawn around the screen. But there's a red teapot which sort of crops up, and the whole film seems to pivot around this red teapot. So it's almost like the film is about the teapot, and the humans are sort of incidental to the teapot's sort of existence.
One of the things that struck me as rather strange about the film was this, because with Ozu, he's always very refined. These middle-class people, I don't know, you'd almost call it first world problems, right?
Mm.
And then bizarrely into this, there's this toilet humor. So somebody comes to meet somebody in their office, and after a few minutes, or at the time I can't now remember, he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I have to go to the toilet." Like, what is going on there? I had no idea.
I resisted when I first started getting into Japanese film. Because of Ozu's reputation, I resisted it for so long. And the very first Ozu film I saw was actually Good Morning, which was, I think it might have been the one that he made after this, or maybe two after this, 1959. And this is quite different because it's all set in the sort of lower middle class, or sort of this sort of slum area, pretty much outside of working class area, just outside of Tokyo. But it's all to do with like this sort of arrival of a TV in the house, and the kids sort of like going on this protest to get their parents to buy them a TV. But it's very whimsical, very slight. But as you say, there's the toilet humour, because, when the boys are all sort of going to school, and they have this sort of farting compositions as they're walking to school. And first time I saw it, I thought, this is not what I'd been led to believe about Ozu. I don't know. It's a very sort of everyday sort of sense of human story, as you say, inconsequential, but somehow very relevant and very moving. I don't know how he manages to sort of distill this essence of existence into these, slight stories.
That's what I was going to say. The thing that strikes me about Ozu is just the mystery of how he achieves his effects. Like, I'm watching this film and it's having an effect on me, but I can't see what he's doing. And particularly, I think, in two ways. One is at a visual level. He creates these sort of poetic visual effects, and you're not sure how, because what he's filming looks rather mundane. And you don't know why these visual images, which might just be inanimate objects or architectural or the tiles on the wall of a bathroom or whatever, suddenly look like a Vermeer painting. And you can't figure out why it is that this is having such an effect on you. And then also kind of emotionally, the films aren't full of a lot of kind of over-the-top emotional histrionics that you get maybe in a Western drama. Things are played more low-key, and yet somehow at the end, the stories had a more powerful effect on you than you realized as you were watching it. And at least for me, I don't know how I got to that point where it suddenly all coalesces at the end. So to me, those are the two mysteries in his film: is how does he create these visual effects, and how does it develop this sort of dramatic power out of little, seemingly inconsequential incidents along the way.
Well, one of the things that Donald Ritchie always said was that Ozu was a modernist, and all of his films are basically set in the time that I'm talking about, the post-war work, the family films. All were sort of basically almost frozen snapshots of how people lived in, say, 1958, which was very different from how people lived in 1953 when Tokyo Story was made. So I always find it fascinating looking at the decor of these films. You know, there'll be little details like calendars on the wall and say the bottles, the teapot, An Autumn Afternoon, which is about the Chishuru playing a father who's basically just aware that he's at the end of his working life and all his friends are dying, his family apart, and everything's changing around him, but just has all these shots of like Tokyo with factory smokestacks and you know, the world's catching up and overtaking him. So with that in mind, I always think of like something like Equinox Flower. It's portraying this sort of really idealized version of life, that everything is composed almost like it looks like a catalogue for ideal homes, or you know, this is how the middle classes in Tokyo should live. They should have all the latest consumer goods. You need a fridge, you need certain types of ornaments. The way that the characters sort of gaze out from the screen, sort of almost as if matching the viewer's eye line, they've always got these sort of beatific grins on their face. You know, it's almost like they're not letting you know what they're thinking inside. And I think that's what I think is amazing, is that sort of there's that underlying sort of melancholy in the storytelling, which is belied by the way that people act.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. The father in particular has always got a sort of, well, generally he's got quite a tolerant smile on his face, and yet he's losing his daughter and disliking very much the way things are going. I don't know. I was going to say he's always got the smile in his face, but he's also in this giant sulk throughout the film. He does, you know, he has this very benign face, I think, as an actor.
There's a sort of fatalistic acceptance that, you know, life, you know, isn't exactly a bowl of cherries. And I think there's some lines at the end of Tokyo Story that make that philosophy explicit, but it's implicit in a lot of his later dramas. And, you know, when you talk about him making the same movie essentially over and over again, which I think is true, that, as far as I know, that's basically true of the last 10 years of his career, right? About 1950. Like, if you look at his earlier movies, they're more conventional in some sense.
Well, the pre-war stuff is really interesting because a lot of it was, you know, again, that whole idea that he's the most Japanese of directors when you're looking at stuff like Dragnet Girl, mm-hmm. which is like a silent gangster movie, right. You know, complete with the sharp suits and the billiard halls. There's nothing Japanese about it almost. Right. And then, of course, I mentioned Good Morning before. That was based on a silent film, I Was Born But, about two little kids in the slums, but very Chaplin-esque sort of humor, or Buster Keaton. I mean, these were his influences. So he was really influenced by Hollywood films. And that idea that the Ozu style is a quintessentially Japanese style, I would throw away. I'd say it's Ozu style is a quintessentially Ozu style, one that he refined across his entire career, you know. So he basically, you can still see camera movements, I think, in Tokyo Story, but then after that he rejects them, and it's just like all static cameras. And also the cutting is quite fast on them. And another thing is, everyone says it's like they're very slow films, but actually you just look at them and they're actually, the editing rhythms are sort of like a Hollywood, you know, sort of action movie at times.
Maybe they need to be fast because if the camera doesn't move, if you're gonna have someone else's face there, you can't just move the camera there. You have to cut.
Like I said, I think Ozu's got an amazing way of just knowing how to calculate when there's visual interest on the screen and your eyes are constantly roaming together and taking it in as the whole sort of gestalt, and then never leaving it on there too long, and then you sort of see the little details, and then it will cut to something else.
Okay, so that's Ozu's Equinox Flower. I've no idea of what the meaning of that is, Equinox Flower. I don't understand that completely.
Yeah, I don't know if it's what the symbolic value.
I might cut that bit out because I've just realised equinox is actually a sort of a seasonal reference.
That's what I assumed. I don't know whether it would be spring or fall, though.
Yeah, I've been a bit slow there. Okay, so that's Ozu, Equinox Flower. What's next up?
What I've tried to do with this list is have sort of links so we can segue nicely into the next film. And the next film is actually the very first Japanese film that I think I saw. I wandered into a screening of it in the Scala in London. Ballad of Narayama, the 1983 version by Shohei Imamura. The connection being here that Imamura was, in the 50s, an assistant director to Ozu. And when you look at Ballad of Narayama, I should just give a little outline of the plot. This is based about 100 years ago in the rural mountainous areas of Japan, where there's a tradition. We're looking at this village community that live in subsistence level. If their harvests fail, they starve. So, winter is spent hunting and spring is spent planting crops. And because their existence is so precarious, you have all these things like arranged marriage, but there's a custom that has crept in that the oldest on the mother's side, the granny of the family, on their 70th birthday, they get carried up to the top of the mountain and abandoned there by their son. So it's their son's duty to take their 70-year-old mother up to the top of the mountain. And
actually, I think 70-year-old fathers are taken up to be abandoned too, because there's one guy who gets taken up and the guy can't quite take him all the way, so he ends up kicking him off the edge of a cliff.
That's right. So it's to show that they're sort of, yes, their lineage isn't quite as strong, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I know the funny thing is this is based on a legend, and I've been there. It's in Shinshu in Nagano Prefecture. There is a mountain called Obasute, so literally throw the old woman away sort of mountain. But the actual film, apparently, ethnographers have looked into this, and there is it never happened in Japan. It's sort of one of these fictional things that was actually in the film was based on actually two stories by a writer in the 50s whose name I temporarily forget, both of which were also filmed in the 50s. So these were written in the 50s, and the Ballad of Narayama was originally filmed in 1958 by Keisuke Kinoshita. And I'm talking about the links between them. Sorry, I was going to say, so Shohei Imamura was linked together with the sort of new wave of Japanese cinema from the 60s. So he made what, by his own admission, were very messy films that focused on working class people eating and having sex. And generally, he always looked at them as if humans were animals. So what he said at one point was that he didn't like working with Ozu, but he said, it's not that I am not influenced by Ozu, it's I didn't want to be influenced by Ozu. So it's funny because what I can see in both of the films, Equinox Flower and Ballad of Narayama, is this sort of scrutinization of the characters. With Ballad of Narayama, it's actually filmed, unlike the 1958 Kinoshita version, which is filmed as if it's a kabuki play, this one is filmed like it's a sort of David Attenborough nature documentary. They actually filmed it over the course of 12 months in the mountains, with the actors coming back and playing out their scenes. First shot, I think you see them, one of them shoots a rabbit, they all run off to get the rabbit. Next thing, an eagle sweeps down and steals it from in front of them. And there's very much a focus on nature and their really harsh existence. But they are very much seen as part of this nature. They're not. It's not like this Hollywood sort of humans battling the environment sort of thing. It's just they are embedded within their landscape, and hence this idea of if you have too many people, too many mouths to feed in the village, you have to get rid of them, and people that aren't pulling their weight go hungry.
Scott?
This one is one that's been quite a while since I've seen it. I just have a few memories, I guess, at this point. One is there's a lot of kind of earthy humor on one level. And then the last part of the movie, if I remember correctly, really kind of shifts to a completely different mood and becomes very philosophical. And also visually, I thought very powerful. But unfortunately, I don't remember the movie that well because it's been quite a few years.
Well, I rewatched it, and
You rewatched it? Okay.
yeah, I rewatched it, and I was just struck by how appallingly violent it is. I mean, quite extraordinarily so, and not just in the human scenes, but in the animal scenes. You know, there's snakes devouring mice. There's, you know, the sex scenes are quite violent in places. It could not be less like Ozu.
Yes, yeah, but all to the general sort of message that Imamura was trying to put across. I think if you look across his entire career, it's always this human-animal metaphor, whether it be stuff like Insect Women in 1963, Pigs and Battleship, which is this great scene at the end. It's all about, you know, black marketers working outside the army bases in Japan, where there's this illegal pork meat scam going on, and it ends up with this just pigs running wildly through the streets. And then, of course, the other Cannes Palme d'Or winner he made, the eel, unagi. Yeah, I mean, always this sort of humans are animals. That's basically his message. They don't.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say Vengeance is Mine is another one, very much in that line.
You've got the pornographers, which is an absolute wild trip through the darker side of human nature. It's terrific.
Mhm.
It's interesting that Imamura was out of the new wave directors of the 60s. He's the only one that really managed to sort of triumph throughout the 80s and keep churning out really great films, of which Ballad of Narayama won the Palme d'Or, that can. But the other big one was Black Rain. That is filmed in black and white, set in the 50s, and features a family trying to marry off their daughter. So it's this pure Ozu setup, apart from the family who happens to have been caught in the radiation blast of Hiroshima. So they're trying to marry off their Hibakusha daughter, or niece, in fact, it is in the film. So there's very... They're so related, Ozu and Imamura. I don't think you could sort of separate them. And the other thing I should mention as well, that when we talk about Equinox Flower, the mother in that, played by the great Japanese actor Kinuyo Tanaka, but she is also the old mother in the original Ballad of Narayama as well.
Oh, right.
Links everywhere.
Well, I mean, we're not linking to anything here exactly, but one of my favorite actresses, Japanese actresses, and she's appeared, you know, in a lot of sort of melodramatic films. I don't think she was ever really given the chance to be in what you might call the art house cinema. But the wife who gets brought into the household in the Ballad of Narayama, her name is Mitsuko Baisho, and she is the sister of Chieko Baisho. And Mitsuko, I think, was in all the great art house hits. I mean, when I looked her up on Wikipedia, I didn't even know she existed. They said that she was in some like 10 masterpieces. And it's incredible. You got these two sisters sort of dominating, you know, kind of these two halves of Japanese cinema.
The actress, based on what I read, the actress that played the old woman was herself only in her 40s. And to make herself look older, had several of her front teeth surgically removed, which is quite a sacrifice for an acting role.
Yeah, because without spoiling it, I guess there's a scene where she is very strong and healthy in the film as a 70-year-old, but so she tries to smash out her teeth to make herself look like she's older to her kids. So she actually wants to go up to the top of the mountain once she's actually.
Okay, I forgot that.
Her idea is that she has to basically set her family in order, get all the kids married off and breeding to produce the next generation. So it's this very, very pragmatic sort of community that she's the sort of main matriarch of. But it's I think it's just got that sort of brutality and beauty, as you say. Yeah.
I think Imamura said something like Ozu is interested in the top half of the human body and I'm interested in the bottom half. I don't know if you think that's fair.
Yeah, he said it was the bottom half of society and the bottom half of the human body.
Right, that's what he said.
No, he's one of my favourite directors, Imamura. I think there's a sort of wit and humour, but it's exactly the same as Ozu, but it's just completely different.
Do you think both can be? I mean, people always talk about Ozu as being a quintessentially Japanese director, but couldn't the same be said about Imamura in a different way, a different aspect of Japanese culture?
Definitely, I would say probably more like the Japanese people that I know and encounter when I go there than the Ozu's families, I think.
When I was reading up on this, I'm sure I came across somewhere where Imamura was saying, you can't trust a word he says, of course, but he said something to the effect that he didn't understand how Westerners could enjoy his movies, because he said, well, how can they possibly understand what I'm trying to say because I'm so culturally Japanese? I don't know that you can trust what he's saying there, of course, because he's playing games and having fun with everything he says. But I think there is some truth in that. There is he is talking about actual Japanese society, not the
side that they project to the rest of the world. I think that's.
Well, it's dangerous to make comparisons across countries, and I'm not an expert on cultures in East Asia, but South Korean films have a lot of kind of, earthiness and violence to them, at least the ones that came in the wave around the 2000s. And yet you don't think of South Korea as being a particularly violent society. So I don't know if there's any connection there, but I'm trying to think of, the directors did movies like Old Boy, but there's a lot of Korean films where things are really pushed to the extreme: emotions, violence, vengeance, etc. And that reminds me a little bit of Imamura. But again, it's like Japan. I don't think of South Korea as being a place riddled with violence. Like, it's easier to understand that sort of thing if you think of a Scorsese movie in New York City or something where we associate it with high crime. I don't know what aspect of Japanese culture that's reflecting. Maybe something in the past. It was probably much more violent in the past.
That's for sure. But I think Imamura was trying to say, look, Japanese people, they lie, they cheat, they want sex. They have all the, it's not all, polite people sitting around tatami mats, admiring a red kettle. If I can be a bit unfair on Ozu.
Yeah, I think it's the Japanese people stripped of all their sort of, I don't know, maybe some say westernized sort of veneer of civilization, but it's just looking behind and looking at people when they're off guard. I think it's that very, Elizabethan style sort of sense of humor. And
they have that expression tatamai and honmai, which is, your real face and your public face. And so you have a face you give to the world. That's your tatemai. And then you have honmai, which is your real feelings. And then I think they even have a third face, which is your secret face, which is the one you don't even show to your nearest and dearest. It's it's probably true. It's probably true of all societies. I'm not sure the Japanese are so very different there. Maybe they just take it more to extremes. Okay, look, we better move on. So what's next?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember the list I gave. Can you pluck one out, maybe?
Okay, well, Hanagatami.
Hanagatami. Okay, well, this is the most recent of the films I've chosen because, to be honest, I mean, like I said, there's a smattering of films here. I wanted to choose stuff that people actually had a chance of watching, and luckily, there's a company, Third Window Films, which have put this beautiful film out. But generally, I'm not a huge fan of contemporary Japanese cinema, or I just don't feel it's the market conditions and the talent working at the moment is quite up to the same level of when, the heyday in the 50s and 60s, even the 70s and 80s. So, but this is a film that was made 2016 by a director, Nobuhiko Obayashi, who is made his debut in the 1970s, late 70s, with a film called House, a psychedelic horror movie, which has become a bit of a cult favorite. He was actually an experimental filmmaker back in the 60s, and not a formalist or an academically trained one, but just someone who liked picking up bits of 8mm film and making his own movies and making these very strange movies that led to a career in advertising. And he was, one of these directors, just aside from House, he's not that well known in the UK or the West in general, although a lot of his films have just been released in the UK. But in Japan, he was, people love his stuff. It's, I always think a corollary would be someone like Alan Parker, that he had this sort of flamboyant style, very experimental, but also very much had his finger on the pulse of sort of youth movements, youth tastes, shall we say. So he made a lot of sort of idol movies in the 80s, stuff like The Girl Who Leapt Through Time is a classic title. In the 2010, so late career, he managed to maintain this very experimental style where he was really embraced all these new digital technologies and video editing. And so he made Hanagatami is an anti-war film. It's like a teen movie based on a group of 16, 17-year-old kids that all just around about 1938, 39, and they're sort of coming of age stories where they're all at this school in this sort of small coastal community. And forgive me if I haven't got the details quite right, because I haven't revisited this for this particular podcast.
Terrible.
I know I was slacking a bit. Yes, it's this sort of story of like a coming of age, young loves and stuff against this backdrop of a war that is sort of happening elsewhere, but it's done in this amazing sort of I can't even say the word, just super saturated colours and sort of superimposed images, and it's 3 hours long at least, and it doesn't feel overstretched. Just these films, you just sit there and just sucked into this sort of weird dream world, so you feel like you were there. So it really does feel like he's sort of conjuring up these sort of spirits from the pre-war era.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the digital technology. I think that allowed him to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do with House, but much more effectively. So when I saw House years ago, I thought, well, this is interesting, but got a little bit tired of it towards the end once I got the point.
Well, that's got that sort of almost Terry Gilliam style surrealism and very much a handmade feel, hasn't it, House? Yeah.
But this one, the visual images were just so striking that it carried me along much further. I still felt that the 3 hour length was a little bit more than necessary, but I thought it was really, from a visual point of view, just fantastic. The way he was able to use these colors in such a creative way. At first, I kind of wondered, is he just showing off? But as the film continued, there really was a method to what he was trying to do. And the visual images were, I think, serving a purpose as part of the story. So, yeah, I think it's definitely a gem that people should take a look at, especially people that like film from a visual perspective. As a drama, I thought it's okay, but nothing exceptional. But the visual style was very striking.
I think it shows like someone who is completely in control of his craft. I mean, the manipulation of the images is just immaculate. I mean, it just can't be faulted at all. The other thing I think is interesting is now we have this sort of digital cinema has given us the ability to make any sort of images we can, and people still just use it to really just create the same sort of recreate action movies that were just an easier way of doing stuff that was done on film. I mean, just trying to make artificial images look like real images rather than just go off in this completely expressionistic tangent. One of the things was interesting that Obi actually died just a couple of years ago of cancer. That he already had been diagnosed with cancer before he set out to make this film Hanagatami. So he was in his late 70s and just was given this. You're given 6 months to live. So he goes, okay, well, I'm going to make one more film. So he makes this 3-hour-long film, which every single frame looks like it's just had all this worked on it. And then he made another film after that as well. So just a remarkable spirit. And I think it comes across in the film as well.
One thing you didn't mention, I think it is one of the most striking things about the film is that the school children, they're played by 35-year-olds, 40-year-olds. It really took me a few minutes to understand what the hell was going on there.
Yeah, that's sort of quite a tradition in Japanese film, I think. I mean, in that I always think of another great pre-war kids movie is Seijun Suzuki's Fighting Elegy, which is all about the rise of fascism via the political figure Kita Iki in the late 30s, as shown by this guy who's just constantly fighting with people in his school and these rival schools trying to be the hardest, and train themselves with like bamboo sticks and shurikens, and this sort of.
But this is not like an American movie where you think, I'm sure that teenage girl is 20 at least. I mean, we're talking about 40-year-olds or thereabouts playing 16-year-olds. I mean, it is deliberately done for some sort of stylistic effect. I mean, it could not be more striking.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of Brechtian sort of thing. But I mean, like I say, with the Seijun Suzuki's Fighting Elegy, I mean, it's a similar thing. They're playing like adolescent boys, but all the guys are just like the sort of 30-year-old actors working Nakatsu at the time.
Interesting you say the Brechtian thing, because I don't like to use the word Brechtian because I'm never quite sure I know what it means, but I was surprised by the end of the movie how emotionally moved I was, because it did kind of push you away all the stylism and the fact that, the people are the wrong age. And there was just all sorts of tricks, and the moon is like 20 times bigger than it should be. You got all this weird stuff going on all the time, and yet at the end of it, I was genuinely moved. More so I think than the Ballad of Narayama or Equinox Flower.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is very much a dreamlike experience, and I always think when you see that there's a film which is going to be 3 hours long, I always sit down and probably in my mind subconsciously ready for myself that things are going to unfold at a different rhythm and that you've got to go with the rhythm of the film.
Yeah.
So I mean, definitely after me, it was just like a sort of a fever dream of experience.
And I just want to mention one other thing. I don't know if this is what this was getting at, but Hanagatami means flower basket. And I do know because I was speaking to a Japanese lady who had sort of written a thesis on this, a PhD thesis on this, where flowers were very bound up with the fascist regime. They used the symbolism of flowers to sort of push the imperialist message. So the different types of flower, lilies, I think, and chrysanthemums in particular, and cherry blossoms. So I'm sure if somebody was more up on the history and culture than I was, they would have seen how he was kind of mirroring that, I suspect. Okay, so shall we move on? So which one shall I have you talk about next?
Well, I was just saying, so as we're talking about abstraction and dreamlike thing, maybe this is a good time to get on to Branded to Kill, which I mentioned Seijun Suzuki as well. I just love this film so much, and it's like a Marmite film. People either get it or they don't get it. This is a hitman story. He's called Goro Haneda. He's in his attempt to raise to the situation of number one hitman in Japan, in Tokyo, against this sort of pop art, sort of abstracted, sort of Baroque landscape of no recognizable Tokyo architecture at all. And it came out in 1968. It came out at a time when two other existential hitman movies came out at the same time, The Samurai and also Point Blank. And I don't know what was in the air, because all of these came out in such a short period of space of time that no one could have been influenced by each other. So it must have been something they were putting in the water in the 60s, shall we say. Seijun Suzuki is often seen as an iconoclast, a maverick, someone who is just having a great big joke at the studio's expenses or at the audience expenses. And I think he's been utterly misread in the same way that Ozu has been misread. He joined Nikatsu in the 1950s, mid-50s, a company that had been closed during the war and kickstarted itself off in the mid-50s, making youth movies and idol movies that were very much dependent on who was the hottest actor, singer sort of at the time. And they specialized in a brand called Mukoku Seki Action, borderless action films. The idea that these films could be like crime thrillers or westerns or musicals or hitman thrillers that could have been made anywhere. They're not just Japanese. They could have been Italian, they could have been American, but they just happened to be in Japan, made in Japan with Japanese actors. So a lot of this group of films, I mean, if you've seen a Japanese western, for example, I don't know,
No, I've never seen one. apart from maybe Tampopo, but I don't think that quite counts.
Well, no, I mean, I guess there's degrees with the Japanese Western where you get some of them which are sort of rooted in the reality of the settlers in Hokkaido 100 years ago, and some that sort of get further and further away, and you get Joe Shishido, the hamster-faced star of Branded to Kill, was in one called Fast Straw Guy, and that literally was just him, you know, fake Western with him wearing a sort of Stetson and a black leather coat.
Aren't the samurai movies essentially Western?
Yeah.
You know, the one that was remade into A Fistful of Dollars?
Yeah, Yojimbo, the Kurosawa.
Those are sort of Westerns in a sense, aren't they?
The ethos is the same. It's just basically, you know, the guy wandering into towns to right wrongs and expose corruption and champion the rights of the underdog. I guess probably hasn't got that sort of whole frontier spirit that the American Western has, but there's, you know, I'd say the Japanese Western is probably similar to the spaghetti Western, but Branded to Kill is, of course, not a Western, it's a hitman movie, and it's like a hitman movie that's just been distilled to its barest atoms. You know, it's the main character, whenever he's going to perform a killing, he gets his, you see him inhaling rice over a rice cooker. Seijun Suzuki at the time said, well, if this was an American movie, you know, you'd get a macho man would be eating a steak before he goes out and does a killing. I was saying, this is a Japanese movie, so we're going to have him turned on by the smell of rice. This was a film that got him fired from Nikatsu. The president of the Nikatsu at the time said, you make films that don't make sense and don't make money. So we don't need directors like you. But actually, if you see a lot of his other stuff, his early stuff, in particular his very early stuff where he was making sort of film noir type films, they're incredibly tight and very accomplished. There was an amazing director on a low budget. People tend to pick out the more sort of Baroque or flamboyant or just plain weird films from his oeuvre. Stuff like Youth of the Beast being another one, and Tokyo Drifter. But there's something about this film that is just so cool. Whether it's just the music, the femme fatales, he's lured off his path by this beautiful woman who is also revealed to be, or hinted to be, an assassin, another hit woman. And you see her in her room and she's just got butterflies pinned up. Everything about it is just designed to make the screen look as interesting as possible. There's movement throughout, there's strange angles. I mean, it's almost like watching a piece of abstract art, I think. And so I think on first viewings, people might find it a rather cold and alienating experience. I think it's a film that I've watched so many times. It's almost like I'm watching a different film every time I see it.
Yeah, what do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think your comment about how it distills the essence of this sort of film is right on the mark. It's like he's trying to just put in all the good stuff and not worry too much about narrative coherence and so on. Obviously, I think his work has been compared to Tarantino.
Ooh, I don't know who though.
Well,
Tarantino.
well, in the sense of, just trying to have fun with the genre and not take it too seriously. You don't think Tarantino's a good comparison?
No, because Suzuki's definitely an original. Because for me, when I look at a Suzuki film, and Branded to Kill is not emblematic of. I think it's the apogee of a certain dimension of Suzuki's filmmaking, but I would say get stuff like Gate of Flesh or Story of a Prostitute, which are all Fighting Elegy, which I was talking about earlier, which are actually all very serious. They have messages and they have intelligence. They're based on original stories. And I think Suzuki, he was an original. I mean, he basically was making, with the Hitman films, he was making so many of them that he had to do it on such a fast timeline that it was a case of let's frame this shot to be as efficient as possible, to be as expressive as possible. So for me, it's like, when I say it's like a distillation of a Hitman movie, I mean, I'm not really into action movies or Hitman movies at all, but I quite like that sort of as a sort of narrative form. And I think what Suzuki's done here is show that film narrative and narrative are two different things, that you can watch a film that progresses by its own dream logic, which is linked by certain images or patterns or rhythms, without it necessarily making sense, that if you had to go back and explain the story, it would be very difficult.
I agree with you about Suzuki being an original, but I guess what I would say is that when I look at like a Tarantino film, it looks like he's trying to copy what Suzuki was doing, in a sense. Like Tarantino's trying to go back and strip mine all the fun stuff from earlier B movies and update it in some way, but he's essentially trying to do the same thing. It's just that he's less original because it's already been done by Suzuki. But maybe I'm missing something.
Well, Suzuki as well, you have to remember, was also working in the confines of the studio system, where he was basically, they said you have to turn out a film every couple of months, and it will have to have this star, it will have to have so many songs or so many gunfights, and he was basically making films to order. So I think Tarantino is more of the auteur, where he's creating stuff. But I know what you're saying. Tarantino does he's like a sort of magpie of filmmaking that will go and find the stuff he likes, grab it all, put it together, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But one of the interesting things is with Suzuki is that after he got fired by Nakatsu, he had a bit of a second lease of life in the 80s, where he made 3 films, his so-called Taisho trilogy, which were all set in 1920s, 1930s Japan, where they were sort of like art house movies, but as typified by the first one, Zigeunerweisen, which is a sort of ghost story that has a very similar approach to narrative and this sort of dreamlike quality and as Branded to Kill. But much as I like them, and I think they're maybe better films than a lot of his Nakatsu films, they don't quite have that sort of sense of fun. I think Suzuki perhaps is someone that needed to have a studio system to rebel against.
I see.
Well, I feel I have to sort of strike a slightly discordant note here. I think the chairman of Nikatsu was right. I'd have sacked him. This is not a film any audience could sit through. They must have been streaming for the exits, assuming that it even got released. Having said that, when I was thinking about it, thinking of all the rude things I could say about it on this podcast, when I was looking back on it, I was remembering it quite fondly. I thought, oh, yes, I like that. I like this bit. But at the time, it was like having needles stuck in my eyes. And the film I sort of wanted to compare it with was Pierrot Le Fou.
Godard.
which is a New Wave film from France, of course. Yeah, Godard. And that was in color, and it was filled with charm. It was, it didn't make an ounce of sense, but it was filled with charm, whereas this one seemed to be, let me remove all the charm I can. The relationships are, nobody's meeting each other at all for an instant. There's no connection between the male character and the female character. They're speaking past each other quite deliberately. The whole thing is sort of broken up in terms of sense, in terms of relationship. And yeah, I mean, I feel the chairman went a bit far because apparently he had a retrospective after he was sacked.
The retrospective was already planned by the University of Tokyo. It was right. The chairman had actually said, cancelled the retrospective. He said, you can't have the films.
Even I wouldn't have gone that far, but oh my goodness me, if I had spent money as the studio on this, I mean, what was he thinking? He must have had, I don't know, he must have had some idea in mind. He must have realized that this was completely unacceptable to his bosses, and yet, he went ahead and did it.
Well, what is interesting about the film is that it's actually the script is credited to someone called, sorry, I can't remember it. It's a pseudonym anyway for an army of 8 people, and there is actually 8 people who worked on the script, including the art designer, the cinematographer, and the editor. So this was always considered to be like not an auteurist project. It's like, let us make a film where the script is informed by the aesthetic. So it is like I say, it's stretching down the actual Hitman, the story down to its basic aesthetic atoms, and as a piece of pure cinema. I mean, I just think there's bits in it, after he's just survived one event. You see him in his room just bouncing a balloon on his, this sense of like, oh, how do you show someone who doesn't show his emotion, show him to be happy? And he bounced around and punching this balloon in the air. And there's things like that which are absurdist, but they just work, I just think.
In my case, I went to a Suzuki film series a few years back, and I had never seen his films, and I saw a bunch of them before I saw this one. And I think that helped me. I went in with almost no expectations for an interesting narrative. I wanted to just see a lot of cool stuff. And so with that in mind, I actually enjoyed the film a lot. I just thought all the visual techniques and the clever, the butterfly on the gun and all that, I just thought he was very clever in the way he did things. But also I thought a lot of the scenes were quite visually striking. Some of the night scenes were sort of a real 1940s noir style cinematography. But then there's a lot of sort of absurdist humor and just a lot of entertaining stuff, as long as you didn't take it too seriously.
And maybe that's exactly it. Maybe I like my films to take me seriously, and I felt like they were doing their thing and having fun, but they weren't serving the audience. I think David Mitchell, the author, says that it's the duty of the author to make you want to turn the page, and it's not enough just to be literary.
But you mentioned the Godard film, or think of the Hong Kong film Chungking Express or something like that. These are they're fun, right? They're not to be taken seriously.
I think you have to remember that the context in which this would have been shown, that at the time Nikatsu were churning out about 50 films a year, which would only show in their cinemas, which had like rolling triple bills, which would have changed on a weekly basis. So people would know the actors. They would know a lot of these films obviously had a lot of scenes that were very similar and a lot of stories that were similar. So people might go there, sit in a film and go, oh, I've seen this before, and not remember the film. So what you're seeing is sort of like this sort of accumulation of this sort of Nikatsu's junk culture, these pulp B movies, all sort of rolled up into a ball and dissected again. And I think people would have been entertained because they would know the actors, they would know the sort of references where they go, oh, I've seen that before, or no, I've never seen someone have an assassination attempt by a butterfly going in front, but it could happen, isn't it? It's the way that it works within the genre, works with the genre, but also against the genre. It's very, I think, ludic is the word I'd use. Very playful.
I'm struck by what you say about you've seen these scenes before. There's a film by Nagase Oshima called, I think, Three Resurrected Drunkards.
Mm-hmm.
And you're watching the film, and then it starts repeating itself. And I think, at one stage somebody got up out of their seat in the cinema and went to tell the person projecting it that actually they were showing the same reel twice. And then gradually, there's just some tiny difference. Somebody said, "Oh no, hang on, he didn't step in the water." It's a very, very amusing idea.
I think that you see that came out the same year as Branded to Kill, roughly, I think, and it also came out. That's you've got the American equivalent where you see the Bob Rafaelson's head with the monkeys in it. Is that they've got a scene like that?
Okay.
So obviously, maybe it was a whole generation that just had enough remaking the same junk all the time and realised let's play with it.
Okay, so we got two left. So we can do Ghost in the Shell 2, or we can do Giants and Toys. What's your preference?
Let's do Ghost in the Shell 2, because it's the only animation on there. And for that reason, you're probably surprised why I'd have mentioned it in the top Japanese movies. And also it's a sequel. So it's like these two things with black marks against it the very beginning. But I should point out the importance of it, first of all, was this was the first ever Japanese animation to play in competition at Cannes. And in the year it played, 2004, yes, it was up against one other animation in that category, which was Shrek 2. And I think, if you put the two films together, you will see a completely different approach to animation. And that's what we were saying with Hanagatami before. Shrek 2 is a great example of, like, you've got the greatest technology in the world, and what do? You basically use this digital animation to make a cine-realistic puppet show. Whereas Ghost in the Shell 2, I think, uses a hybridized mixture of hand-drawn animation, computer animation that completely fits within tandems with the sort of ideas that it's trying to put out. And I think that this is more like an art movie than an animation. Basic synopsis is that if you know the Ghost in the Shell world, it's this sort of near future where everything is run, every interaction is conducted over fiber optic cables and the internet, and we are all sort of to various degrees hybrids between humans and robots. So, you might have a synthetic brain or synthetic eyes. A lot of people, everyone has these augmented bodies, and the fact that we're all part of this interconnected world means that you are subject to being hacked by evil spirits as well, and this hacking can literally take the form of a physical assault. And so the film focuses on a government anti-cyber terrorism squad, and the main characters there. And in the very first one, you had this character who was we know that there was the remake in Hollywood with Scarlett Johansson, but the main character was this Major, who was this beautiful woman, but the irony was that her body was not her own. She was basically had a human brain and this robot body that was owned by the government itself. So what's these films do is play with this idea of what is real, what is illusionary, what is synthetic, what is organic within the animated format. And I think the director Mamoru Oshii, he's taken the source material comes from a manga, but he's really rigorously worked it to fit in with his sort of working methods for the animation. I remember the very first time I saw this film, just the opening credit sequence, which is a scene of like this cyborg being born out of you see this sort of metal sphere sort of splits into two, then it sprouts out these fake limbs and eventually build these two crash test dummy like creatures. It's all done in CG, absolutely stunning. And well, there's a lot more to the film that I can discuss, but I'll just pass over to you for your feedback. Otherwise, I'll just witter on indefinitely.
Well, that's ironically the scene I best remember also is the opening credit. I was really struck by that, seeing it in the theater years ago. I would just add that I'm not too familiar with a lot of Japanese animation, but I saw this one first, and then I saw Ghost in the Shell later, the original one. And I thought the remake was actually much better. I don't know if that's a generally shared view. But Ghost by remake, I mean Ghost in the Shell 2 is better than the original.
The second one, yeah.
So if someone saw the original and assumed Ghost in the Shell 2 was not going to be as good, they might want to rethink and check it out.
I think I remember at the time I saw Ghost in the Shell 2 making the comparison, which is like the difference between Terminator and Terminator 2, that the technological advances had come along so much in the 8 years, I think, between Ghost in the Shell 1 and 2, that it resulted in a lot more fluid. The animation looks a lot more impressive. Ghost in the Shell 1 has very detailed, cinerealistic sort of hand-drawn style. There's very little computing in it, and so the problem is when you get very detailed hand-drawn animation, it doesn't tend to move very much. But I think both of them, I mean, like certainly the first one as well, the main story is basically about like a rogue computer virus that was engineered for sort of cyber warfare, goes rogue and mutates to develop a consciousness of its own. And I think, this was, well, the actual original mangas were written in the late 80s. They're so prescient, predicting a world that basically is happening as we're watching, we're witnessing here. And it's so depressing just to extrapolate, where we're going.
I enjoy Japanese anime very much, but I found Ghost in the Shell, I found it very cold movie. I didn't warm to the characters. I didn't feel connected to them. And I was sort of thinking about, the latest big hit, Makoto Shinkai's Your Name. And that was all, it was a completely, the whole thing is emotion, from start to finish, and, about, the bonds between people. And I was struck by that difference. I mean, I suppose this, the hard sci-fi of cyborgs, I mean, inevitably it's going to be colder, but that was the difference that struck me there.
I think Mamoru Oshii is definitely an ideas man. He's not a character man. And I've often thought with both of the Ghost in the Shell films, you're watching them and it's difficult to know where the dramatic beats are. It sort of ends, lots of explosions, whatever, and you go, oh, was that it? I didn't realize. I thought we still had another hour to go, whatever it was. I don't know. It's difficult to see where the film is going, but I just love the way that this particular one, it just deals with the way we perceive the world and how we're going to perceive the world in a sort of post-human sort of in a machine. Well, even like the way that some of the images are framed, that they don't look like they've been sort of represented by a human eye.
I think the film would appeal to people that like Blade Runner in terms of the subject matter and also the fact that there's a strong visual style to it.
And like what I say, that cyber birth at the beginning, I mean, this was, I know Mamoru Oshii, when I was living in Tokyo when it came out, and the Museum of Modern Art there put on an exhibition inspired by Innocence called The Dolls of Innocence. And it was a lot to do with the Hans Bellmer, the Swiss surrealist, with his famous doll sculptures were a major inspiration on the look of the film. It just has this weird grab bag of sort of influences in its sort of visual design that just, I don't know, difficult to explain. That sort of, some of it looks like Blade Runner, some of it looks like Agatha Christie, some of it looks like, the sort of this Chinatown sort of gangster shootout scene, and that sort of weird, surreal Escher-like dream where they get stuck in this sort of recursive loop in this in the cyber hackers sort of domain, this sort of weird fortress.
Okay, so that's Ghost in the Shell. So what's your last one, Jasper?
Giants and Toys, and this is probably the one of the least familiar of the films I chose. I mean, we were just discussing how obscure a lot of these are, which I think is just the nature of Japanese films in general. All of the films I mentioned have been released on Blu-ray, and this is no exception. It just came out last year. As a confession, I worked on it. I produced all the extras and stuff for it, and it's just always been one of my favorite Japanese films. I can't remember the first time I discovered it. It's sort of, in a nutshell, sort of like Mad Men in Tokyo. It's a 1958 film directed by Yasuzo Masamura, who was, actually I'll talk about Masamura a bit later, but the story is basically we have three rival confection companies all out on a full-out advertising war to the finish, and the film was intended as a satire of the new consumer capitalism that was overtaking Japan in the sort of post-war era. Well, this was after the post-war, I guess. This is 1958, the year the Tokyo Tower was built, by which time Japan was well on its way to be a modern, industrialized nation, one of the biggest economies of the world.
Is this when it's sort of really taken off then? Is this sort of bubble economy time or a bit before that?
Well, much before that. It's the economic miracle years. I think you would say the post-war era, I would always say, is, after the occupation ends in 1952, and it's a period of reconstruction. But I think by the time you get to 1958, Tokyo Tower sort of symbolizes that they'd reconstructed everything, and now it was construction for the sake of construction. Shinkansen and various other trappings of Tokyo as we know it to this day.
Yeah, this really shows you how fast things changed, because the post-war films, first of all, they were black and white, and they were portraying a society that was, devastated by the war. There was a lot of poverty and suffering. And this one has got the Technicolor and the jazzy modern elements, and 1958 was not that long after movies that presented a very different Japan, right? You just go back to the late 40s, and Japan looked like a very depressed, poverty-stricken country. There's this sense that things are really changing fast. It's beginning of an exciting period, although it is a satire on those, as you suggest. But and ironically, it's the same year as Equinox Flower.
Exactly 5 years after Tokyo Story, and it's just like you're looking at the Tokyo
Right.
of Tokyo Story and the Tokyo of Giants and Toys it might well be a different planet.
Right.
So there's a few things to say. Masamura was one of those directors that emerged in the post-war era, making his debut sort of 56, I think. But he was one of this generations that the first wave of modernists that sort of anticipated the new wave, but sort of came after all your Ozus and Mizoguchis and Kurosawas had been active before the war. When he studied law, but then he got the opportunity to study cinema overseas in Italy in the early 50s, 52 I think it was. And so when he came back to Japan, he was immediately sort of like aware of this sort of history of Japanese cinema, and aware that if he was a filmmaker, he is part of an ongoing history. So we need to modernize Japanese film. And one of the complaints was always Japanese film was too slow. Giants and Toys is really fast in terms of the snappy dialogue, like we say, Mad Men, the editing rhythms, and it's all to capture this idea of like this sort of advertising campaign that just goes completely off the rails and gathers momentum and far faster than anyone can control it. So that sort of speed is built into the narrative. The other thing that's interesting is that, as we mentioned, it's widescreen. This was a time when Japanese cinema had just switched to the sort of CinemaScope formats in 1957 and colour. And so both of which marked it out as a prestige sort of production, but it references the threat that the traditional advertising industry had from television. You've got like the music industry coming in there. It's just basically this sort of portrait of a society which is just getting overwhelmed by media.
Yeah, I find in watching Japanese films, one of the things I like best is seeing them through the lens of history and thinking about how each one reflects an era. And this one is really at a turning point. I mean, first of all, the film was made in 1958, and one theme in the movie is the space age, right?
Yes.
Using astronauts and rockets to sell candy. And that was 1 year after Sputnik. So it was right at the beginning of the space age. And like you say, it couldn't be more different from a movie like Tokyo Story 5 years earlier in every respect. And I would say the same about Branded to Kill, which very much had the look of a 60s film, mid-century modern aesthetics and so on. But as you go through Japanese films, they're very much of their era. When I started watching Ozu films, they seem so different, so foreign to me as an American. This movie seemed very American, even though it was the year as Equinox Flower.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, I'm 60, I'll be 68 this year. So the late 50s would be my maybe earliest memories. And it really had a little bit of the feel of what America was like back then, too, in a way that you don't get with many other types of Japanese films. It was really capturing the time very effectively and the frenetic pace of change in the country. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about this film is just the glimpse into that period in history, and also the actress, which I thought was wonderful. I don't know how you felt about her, but to me, she kind of carried the film.
That's the main plot in is when one of the companies, they discover this sort of slum dwelling girl with a bit of a zesty sort of perky sense of humor that they think, well, we'll groom her as our campaign girl, ignoring the fact that all her teeth are rotten, which is not obviously a look when you're trying to sell candies. Yes, and then she, of course, develops this sort of ego, which they basically create a monster, don't they? Really,
Mm-hmm.
It's a funny film. I mean, it's witty, and it's just that the final scenes, just you're laughing at the absurdity of it all. I mean,
and what's the reason that the girl has such terrible teeth? Is that just a joke about the fact that they're selling candy? So I couldn't quite work out what that was about.
Yeah, and that just people would do, I guess, if you're from the working class in Japan in a period that you've just grown up in the post-war period with no food.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind when you watch these films is that it was 360 Japanese yen to the dollar. So maybe 500 to the pound or whatever.
Mm.
So when you hear these amounts, if you translate them, I'm an economist, so I translate them as I'm watching, you realize it was still a pretty poor country even then. Like she was being paid a couple dollars a day on her job before she was plucked into the successful role. The health, the post-war period in Japan was just brutal. So there would have been hungry people with bad teeth and so on. But again, it was right at that pivot point. And there's something interesting about a country that is just on the edge of dramatic change. In some ways more interesting, I think, than after the changes occurred.
Yeah.
I got married in China in 1994 and went back occasionally over the years. And there was something particularly interesting about China, just as you sensed it was about to go through massive changes. And now when you go and visit, to me, as an outsider, it seems less interesting, although I suppose in some sense it's better for the Chinese people. They're not as poor. But just at that moment where all these possibilities are opening up, that is a really interesting pivot point for a society. I don't know, you guys, maybe there's something you could compare to the point where London, got back from the poverty of the post-war period and the swinging 60s started or whatever.
That's an interesting point. I think the British could maybe relate to this film, Giants and Toys. They could maybe relate to it more than the Americans could, because Americans didn't really have the war and after was prosperity, but
Right.
For the British and I guess the Japanese, there was a long period of really quite serious deprivation.
Wasn't there a famous British film about a satire on the commercialism after World War II?
you've got the Ealing stuff. You've got stuff like the Man in the White Suit, isn't it? But that's earlier. I think it's interesting in Japan round about this time. Like you say, everything changed like 1958. And in terms of cinema, as I say, it switched over to widescreen and colour. Part of it was a symptom of the fact that during the war, most of the cinemas had been knocked down and destroyed. So there was a massive program of rebuilding cinemas. When they rebuilt them, they wanted them to be big, lavish, deluxe sort of movie palaces that could fit widescreen films on. So the films were made to fit the new cinemas. So there was that sort of change there, that these sort of cinemas that were being built in 1958 were basically reflecting, like, the Tokyo cityscape and the changing landscape in general. They were part of that landscape. But the other thing, of course, is that you had a generation that's, were just coming of age that had never fought in the war. And maybe their parents had. We had the same with German cinema. The German cinema of the 60s was really energized because it was just totally not talking about the past. It was forward looking. I don't think, I've seen lots of Japanese sort of jazz movies from around this era, or like the youth movies. They have a lot of energy to them in a way that British ones don't. If you watch it, you compare it with stuff like the Cliff Richard movies, Summer Holiday or something. They don't. Wasn't quite as the same revolution.
Well, we had Room at the Top or whatever. I can't think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, look, we better bring it to a close, I think, because we've been going on a bit. So, which of these 6 films would you recommend somebody who is reasonably new to Japanese film? And leaving these 6 films aside, if somebody said, well, gee, I don't think I've ever seen a Japanese film, what would you advise them to see if you wanted them to go on and watch lots more Japanese films? And maybe it's one of the 6 and maybe it's a different one.
Good God. Well, I think probably Giants and Toys is the most accessible out of all of these. I think one of the things that initially attracted me to Japanese cinema was, having never been to the country, was its sort of sense of alienness to me. And the more I've got to know Japan, it doesn't seem alien anymore. But they do have a different way of making films and a different... I don't think anything like Ghost in the Shell 2 could ever be made outside of Japan. So I think that's it depends if you want a challenge or not, but definitely Giants and Toys, I think, is one that everyone can go with. In terms of one that's not on the list, I was just thinking about this recently, actually, why I didn't put it on the list. There's a film called Shall We Dance from 1997, the ballroom comedy, about a salaryman who surreptitiously takes up ballroom dancing after work hours and hides this guilty secret from his wife until she finally finds out. Funny film, and one that we can all relate to and identify with, but which unfolds in a geography and a culture that you might not be familiar with.
Okay, I don't know, Scott, if you want to play this game or not, but.
Well, for people not familiar with Japanese films, there's probably some that are more accessible on first viewing than others. So they might want to start with maybe a Kurosawa film like High and Low, which is, you can, it's a very impressive film, and it's also accessible because it's a crime drama. And then if they're looking for something kind of a more recent story, I thought the film Nobody Knows was very good, directed by Kurita.
Yeah,
that's my favorite Kurita film. It's sort of a tragedy, actually. Devastating movie, actually, to watch. But that would, I think, give people insights into some of the high quality film. On this list, I think it would depend on what the person likes. Some of these would appeal to some viewers more than others.
Which is your highest rated movie on the list in terms of your personal tastes?
My personal taste would be the Ozu, I guess. He's one of my all-time favorite directors, probably my favorite Japanese director. So the Equinox Flower. That's not my favorite Ozu film, but I thought it was very, very good. But I think I liked pretty much all of these. So, but I definitely think there's some of them that would not appeal to people. It's a matter of taste. And if you go into like Giants and Toys not knowing what you're going to see, you might be put off at the beginning. Same with several of the other films.
But literally, I haven't included a single samurai movie in that list, for example, or I don't think there's even a single period drama. So, you could play this game indefinitely, couldn't you? It's your top picks. And it's just like, as soon as I came up with the initial list, I was like, damn, why didn't I put that on? And this is just the films that are readily available. Like Kurosawa is a great example. Go and watch Hidden Fortress if you're a George Lucas fan. If you've seen Star Wars, then Kurosawa made Hidden Fortress like 30 years before and did everything.
Yeah.
Well, I think I would go with Hanagatami because I was just blown away. It almost felt too long at the start, but by the end, it felt like it was the right length. And then if I was to send somebody to see an enjoyable, gentle entry into Japanese film, I would go with A Distant Cry from Spring. But I don't think you can get it. I had to get a friend to download it for me and send it across along with the subtitle file. So there you go. Okay, well, unless anybody has got anything more to say, thank you so much, Jasper. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time today. That was really good fun.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favor to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.